Study Session 3. In this study session, we shall be discussing the topic Penetration Thesis. This study session explores the penetration of Western capitalists on African societies. We shall also examine the impact of this on African polity and consequently African politics as we know it today. When you have started this session, you should be able to firstly discuss the penetration thesis. You should also be able to write a discourse on the underdevelopment of Africa by the colonizers. And thirdly, you should be able to draw up your own conclusion to the penetration thesis in addition to that of the proponents. Western capitalist penetration. A simple way of defining Western capitalist penetration is to see it as a totality of the processes and procedures, structures and linkages which were put in place by the colonizer that was done in order to effectively accomplish self-serving transformation of pre-colonial political economy into a form of capitalist one. It can also be seen as the process by which pre-colonial political economy lost its internal dynamics and independence. It seeks to explain how African societies were turned away from self-directed development and made appendages of how pre-colonial African mode of production had the capitalist mode forcibly superimposed upon it. Articulation of penetration thesis. Now let me tell you that the penetration thesis seeks to explain the roots of African situation today. In this attempt, it takes stock of, or shall I say, evaluates pre-colonial political and social conditions as well as the state of the economy. In a nutshell, an assessment of the totality of African existence in the pre-colonial era is considered in the following, and the conclusions are reached. 1. The African states and societies had developed in most parts of the continent, and the political order and economic systems that provided adequately for their members without reliance on external assistance. Testimonies from earlier European explorers represent objective evidences in support of this fact. Another conclusion is that African societies had, on the eve of European penetration, developed an impressive technological standard that served the needs in the productive processes as well as in fabrication of works of arts and artifacts compared with achievements of other societies of that period. In addition to that, the pattern of exchange among pre-colonial societies was dictated by real needs of the people. Exchange across borders was equal and chimeric. And finally, African states and societies of pre-colonial era, like other human societies, had possessed internal dynamics which was capable of generating self-directed auto-development. This penetration thesis then proceeds to examine colonial situation in Africa and what transformation had taken place. So the conclusion is drawn that the whole colonization processes and colonial order in its entirety represents, from the point of view of Africa, that a maldevelopment which is a far cry from natural course of movement of pre-colonial situation. Please, I want you to reflect on this point, that the whole colonization processes and the colonial order in its entirety represents the viewpoints of Africa, maldevelopment which is a far cry from natural course of movements of pre-colonial situation. Finally, the state of affairs in Africa after flag independence. I quote, in view of the Africa experience in the colonial situation
and deplorable state of affairs in the post-colonial states and society is traced to the abiding features of colonialism and imperialism enterprise that put colonialism in place of the first instance. So, this lets us know that this period is referred to as neo-colonialism stage, referred to as neo-colonial stage of Western capitalist penetration. The foregoing represents the premises on which the proponents of penetration thesis base their arguments. Now let's go to the consequences of penetration. In the arguments in support of penetration thesis, its proponents examine the first and foremost consequences of penetration of one society by itself and concluded as follows. A penetrated society cannot be said to retain all its characteristic features once the business of penetration is in full swing. I want you to know that this is because certain discontinuities are bound to occur since the penetrator, or shall I say, penetrating agent, is at the same time a transformer with a set of objectives in his mind. These objectives are subjectively defined and cannot be executed unless the transformer or prime mover, shall I say, stops the aspects of indigenous order or entire indigenous order. Thus, the interruption of indigenous order followed the introduction of new things into the society, which further complicated the matter and ultimately caused distortion of the original but now penetrated society. Can I conclude by saying that since the external prime mover has now taken charge of the entire society by exercising multipurpose dominance, the internal dynamics of the penetrated society is now externalized. Henceforth, the penetrated society would depend on the external prime mover for its vital activity, automatically including direction, rate, and character of development of society. A penetrated society becomes the shadow of its former self. To take us further, let's go to how the colonies were underdeveloped. 1. Once the colonizer seized the initiative of vital activities in the penetrated society, he embarked on a massive satellization of the economy of the colony and its culture, metropolitan economy and culture. As the metropoles developed themselves through the resources found in the colonies and unleashed further resources by means of their own technology, the colony was systematically underdeveloped in the same process. In the early part of Western capitalist penetration, emphasis was on the labor as a resource. Thus, millions of Africans were shipped to Europe and North America during this transatlantic slave trade. Reflection. Also, later on, it was mineral resources, agricultural produce, and other goods of value. The introduction of mining nexus consolidated satellization of the colonies, further completed the economic pressure on the Africa. The resources lost to Europe through these various methods of exploitation enriched the Western capitalist metropoles, while African societies were impoverished. In its crude colonial form, this exploitation lasted, like I said initially, between 100 and 500 years. You should now imagine the amounts of resources cut off over this long period of time. Number 2, indigenous technology was killed in order to eliminate possible competition between the imported technology and the indigenous. This is particularly the case in areas where indigenous technology had demonstrated superiority. The case of textile technology and distillation of alcoholic drinks readily come to mind in this respect. Prohibition and importation were employed by colonizers to affect the policy of technological dominance. And the first and foremost widely used was prohibition. In such cases, the use of technology to produce certain goods is simply prohibited. Thus, the indigenous gin became illicit gin in the colonial Nigeria because distillation of alcohol was prohibited. The reason for this act was totally economic. It was designed to give various drinks imported into the colony monopoly of liquor markets. Now let me just give you a hint. The indigenous technology for the production of arms and ammunition was also prohibited. The reason for this was military. The colonizer also wanted to ensure that it enjoyed monopoly of force in case of military showdown between his administration and the nationalists. And such an attack on indigenous technology served as a precursor for dumping of inferior goods from the metropole, which later served as an alternative to the products of indigenous technology, especially clothing materials and also materials for construction of shelter as well as food items. Now you should know that this is the root of technological dependence that African societies are now experiencing. 3. The third point in this aspect, which I want you to take note of, is that the exploitation of capital into the colonies in form of investments as well as capital for running financial institutions like banks and insurance companies by metropolitan-based companies. Such investments were basically backed by the political dominance of colonizers, which yielded bumper interests that were repatriated as a regular intervals to swell the stock of capital available in the metropole, which, while the colony was by the same amount repatriated and impoverished. Now imagine the huge amounts of capital siphoned off over scores of years. And this old process continues in new forms today. Here's a tip for you. Know that in this assessment of proponents of penetration thesis, politics in Africa today has its origin in Western imperialist intrusion in the continent over a long period of time. Number 4. This talks about the superimposition of alien values, perspectives, beliefs, superstitions, and idiosyncrasies to the neglect of indigenous ones did not in any way help the cultural advancement of the colonies. Thus, the colonial society was first to learn new ways, and a new language had to be learned, a new religion, and a new mode of worship was also introduced, while the colonized spent all his entire energy learning these new ways. His own culture was not in any way promoted. The imposed mimicry and catching up mentality dealt severe blows to the confidence of the colonized. And these psychological problems sometimes resulted in self-rejection, as this could happen to any of you. This is reflected in the Africans' love of goods and services on foreign origin. Of course, it is observable that even in post-colonial Africa, in the choice of social, economic, and political models and ways of doing things, the ruling classes in the continent are particularly guilty of self-rejection. The situation is so bad that some post-colonial African states mounted massive campaigns for self-reliance as a development strategy because pervasive rejection of Africa has been identified as a source of underdevelopment. Another important point I want you to take note is that the colonial society was first to learn these new ways. It wasn't its decision. A new language had to be learned, a new religion and a mode of worship were introduced while the colonizer spent all his energy, like I said, learning these new ways, all of his energy. He learned this new culture, and his own culture was not promoted. The imposed mimicry and catching up mentality dealt severe blows to the confidence of the colonized. It is pathetic because these psychological problems sometimes resulted in self-rejection. This is reflected in the Africans' love of goods and services of foreign origin. Conclusion on penetration thesis. After an intense analysis of the discontinuities and distortions that have been brought about in African societies through Western capitalist penetration, take note that a huge number of conclusions are drawn by the proponents of the penetration thesis. For easy understanding, these conclusions are outlined below. The first one is that the seed of development of every society inheres in the culture and economic activities of the society. Therefore, African societies will have achieved a huge level of development compatible with their efforts and endowment if they were left alone and without any intrusion of an outsider. Secondly, the externalization of dynamics of development which occurred in the process of penetration deprived the society of the opportunity to employ their productive efforts and endowments for their own use. The satellization which this process brought about extinguished independence of the states and society, and therefore the degree of development achieved by penetrated societies reflected the degree allowed by external prime mover, which is the colonizer. The third conclusion on this penetration thesis is that the Western capitalist penetration was not designed in any way for the benefits of Africans but Europeans, and therefore the whole relationship between the colonies and the metropoles was totally exploitative, leading to the impoverishment of Africans. Little wonder, therefore, that the political economy of Africa is that of underdevelopment. Number 4. The present economic backwardness, social disarticulation, political instability, and failure of Western type of democratic practice, ignorance, and diseases are the outcrops of the multifarious ways in which Western capitalists penetrated, and its structures shaped the course and contents of development in Africa today. Moreover, the first groups of people to articulate the penetration thesis were Westernized early African nationalists. Their early writings about the plight of African. This is particularly the case with the works of Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, Obafemi Awolowo, Jomo Kenyatta, Ahmed, Shekau Toure, Kwame Nkrumah, Modibo Keita, Leopold Senghor, Patrice Lumbaba, Julius Nyerere, and a host of others. They were joined by Africans and diaspora to articulate the thesis. Most outstanding among these were W.E.B. Du Bois, George Padmore, and C.R. James, who identified African struggles as young people in Pan-African movements. The African scholars, in search of explanation for Africa's underdevelopment, have now delivered incontrovertible evidence for the role which Western capitalist penetration has rarely played in the conditioning of African development, which is reflected in its economy and politics boldly. The most outstanding of such scholars is Samir Amin. Others are Frantz Fanon and Walter Rodney. They all condemn imperialism for the African predicament. Now please take note that the colonies were underdeveloped by satellization of their economies to the metropolitan ones, coupled with the following mechanisms. Introduction of money nexus in taxation in cash and kind. Also, arrests of the development of indigenous technology, pillage, slave trade, and unequal exchange. Now let's have the study session summary. In this study session, we have discussed the penetration thesis. And we said that the penetration thesis traces the roots of the African political, economic, and social situations to Western capitalism. We also noted that Western capitalist penetration of Africa entails the multipurpose way in which the West eroded independence of African societies.